Hello class, and welcome to another video on politics with me, Professor Weiner. Today we're going to be going over how to define concepts, otherwise known as conceptualization. So, get a beverage agenda, let's get started. Okay, so in this short video, what we're going to be going over is conceptualization. Now, what is this? Conceptualization is the process through which we identify the kind of key components of a thing to make it that thing, such that we can understand and recognize and measure and count, for instance, right? Collect data on that thing moving forward, how we know it when we see it. An example could really be anything. You can conceptualize, government. You can conceptualize institutions. You can conceptualize war. You can conceptualize culture, right? You can conceptualize political participation. Anything that you want to define as an important phenomena or thing in the world can be broken down into its key component parts, right? Its necessary and sufficient conditions. These necessary and sufficient conditions together, when observed, clue us into the fact that okay, that thing is present. Here's an example. I have a cup, right? I hope you can see the cup. This is the cup, right? How do I conceptualize a cup? Well, first things first, it needs to hold water or hold a liquid, right? It needs to be able to hold a liquid, right? Because that's the purpose of the cup. It also, if the cup is round on the bottom, right, it needs to be able to stand on its own, otherwise it will fall over and spill. So we want it to be able to hold liquid. We want it to be able to stand on its own. In order to drink from it, it needs to have an open top end, right? These are three things that seem to conceptualize a cup. If these three things are present, then I know that does qualify as a cup. And if they're not, it's not a cup. There can be also other conditions. For instance, you could add to, if you wanted, that a cup maybe needs to be taller than it is wide. Otherwise, it might be a bowl, right? And maybe it doesn't have a handle, because if it has a handle, it's kind of like a mug, right? This is the exercise of conceptualization. And it actually becomes crucial when we're studying politics scientifically. So let's take a look at some quick slides to go over a few more examples, just to really hone in on this idea.
Okay, welcome to the slides. As stated here, this is the lecture video on concepts and constructs, and finding this tricky balance between precision and abstraction, right? Taking abstract ideas and trying to define what they are with specificity, enough specificity such that we can operationalize and measure these abstract ideas that we want to study and learn more about. So we'll just start with a kind of exercise here by asking a question. And I am not an art historian. I am not an artist, as we know. So this is kind of an exercise a little bit in opinion, but also in understanding why it's important to conceptualize. So we ask, is this painting by John Curran titled Old Guy, Oil on Canvas from 1994, is this painting masculine? Is it depicting masculinity? Well, the answer depends on how we define masculinity, right? And thus how we know if it is or is not there. For instance, we're defining masculinity as just simply demonstrating characteristics that are attributed to the male sex, then yes, this man has a beard, thus signaling that he is a man, in which case, if based on this definition of what masculinity is, how it's conceptualized, this depicts masculinity, yes. However, let's imagine then in turn that we want to define masculinity differently. We want to say that demonstrating characteristics that are attributed to the male sex, sure, but we want to add to that Masculinity implies patriarchal dominance, right? In reference to a gender hierarchy, right? That it has to be understood relative to femininity and what that means in overall kind of power balance within the patriarchy. If that is how we're defining masculinity and how we know it when we see it, or that's how we want to conceptualize masculinity for a purpose of research, for instance, then this does not really fall into that definition, right? So masculinity is not depicted here. Something else is, right? This is the process, and this is why it's important to really get to be specific about what it is we're talking about, because while it might be a matter of opinion and we could discuss, is this or is not this not masculine? If we're trying to observe the world and, research it and create knowledge about it, it's a really bad thing when two different scholars or two different people are saying, this is there, this isn't there. We're talking about a thing, but nobody's talking actually about the same thing. And when we're thinking about things, what we're actually talking about here are constructs. Now, in research, we can sometimes be interested in variables like income or education, which are relatively concrete, right? We can measure them, we know them when we see them because they're relatively objective. But then there are also ideas within the world of political science, for instance, that are a little bit tougher to nail down. Like what is power? It's crucial to the understanding of the political world, but what exactly is it? What is influence, right? And what's the difference between power and influence? Answering those questions requires that we use conceptualization. But these concepts are actually what we call in the social science world constructs, which are abstract ideas that we choose or we create or we define in order to further the development of research and engage with questions that are important to understanding broader social and political phenomena. Now, constructs are kind of like ideas like intelligence, right? Ambition, power, like I've just said. We can't touch or see them, measure them in the same way that we can income, right? But we infer its presence and we can quantify it for the purposes of research through behaviors, statements, or other indicators that we can get explicit about and, discuss why they are the critical components of this construct such that we can actually study power. Otherwise, we'd just be left being like, well, I guess nobody knows what it is, and so we thus can't study it. And that's just simply not acceptable to social and political scientists. Now, in getting down to the brass tacks of how this is accomplished, we have to think about what's called necessary and sufficient conditions. Now, these are a foundational logic, as is written here. We use it in social sciences, but we also, it's also used in philosophy, in math, because it's a clear logic defining and clarifying the boundaries of constructs, right? This is like where I can know for sure what it is, such that if the following conditions are met, then it is there, right? And that's the boundary. If those things aren't met, then it's not technically within the boundaries of this concept, right? Now they're different. Necessary conditions are things like that must be present for an event or a concept to occur. One example is kind of like an even number. An even number must be divisible by 2 in order to be even. If that's not there, then it is not even, period, right? Now, sufficient conditions are specifying that when these conditions are met, when all these conditions are present, then a concept is there. Like a concept is present, the concept is happening. It can be a little bit tricky because, what's the difference between necessary and sufficient conditions and how do they, is sufficient conditions just always necessary conditions combined? Not quite. It's best to just do a practice. So the first concept we can kind of look into as an example might be a matriarch, right? What is a matriarch and how do we know one when we see one? Well, the necessary conditions might first be, one might be that the matriarch is female. And this is just, an individual who identifies as a woman, right? That's a part that seems to be a necessary condition. Another one might be that a matriarch holds a position of authority and respect, influence not just in general, but within a community, right? A family, a clan, a tribe, some kind of group that collectively makes decisions. And then in turn, another maybe element there of this concept might be a necessary condition would be seniority, right? Or, elderly even, where seniority or age suggests a kind of wisdom or experience that needs to be trusted, right? Maybe that's kind of the source of authority within the community. And now together, all three of these become the sufficient conditions for a matriarch. When all three are present together, then we know a matriarch is present and there. But when we look at other ones, it gets a little bit trickier. For instance, we can conceptualize political efficacy, right? Now, in the literature and political science, political efficacy is often conceptualized as having two necessary conditions. The first being internal efficacy, which refers to when an individual believes fully in their ability to understand and participate in politics, right? So I know what is happening politically, I understand politics, and I believe in my ability to participate in politics. Simultaneously, a second dimension is a second necessary condition would be external efficacy, which is when that individual also believes that the government will respond to needs and demands when participation occurs, right? So that they not only have a confidence in their ability to be a part of political representation, but that they can in fact be represented when they participate. And together, these do form sufficient conditions, but we might specify that they need to be both at maybe a certain level, right? A certain degree of both of them simultaneously. It's possible, for instance, that somebody might have a high degree of internal efficacy, but possibly a low degree of external efficacy. And without these two necessary conditions being sufficiently high, we can't fully, assert that that individual has strong political efficacy, right? Now, it's important to understand this, as well as with the matriarchy, that there can be disagreement about how these are conceptualized, these constructs are conceptualized. And what's more, they might be slightly different depending on context, but without these basic kind of this basic sort of first level conceptualizations, moving forward with these kinds of comparisons across contexts, across nations, across cultures or communities becomes impossible, because we can't at least start from a consensus, a common ground about what it is we're even talking about. But once we do define what we're talking about, then we can start to think about operationalization. And this is key, right? Then we can start to figure out how we want to measure, these elements, these necessary conditions together, right? This is the process of, turning a concept into an actual variable for analysis, for research, for study, right? And sometimes this, actually requires additional conceptualization. For instance, with political efficacy, what is internal efficacy? Maybe we define that again, right? Do another conceptualization to say that means confidence in the knowledge of politics and how it's working, but also an interest in participating in politics, right? And that both of those must be present. If I have confidence about my knowledge about how the American political system works, but I have no interest in participating in it, then internal efficacy isn't really there, right? And so again, we can do conceptualization on many levels, not just at the kind of bird's eye view with a high level of a concept, but internally at different subsets within that concept as well.
The process of conceptualization is so crucial, not just in how it allows us to observe, measure, and understand the political world around us, and generally speaking, the social, all the world around us. but it can also allow us to understand differences between two things and two phenomena, right? Understanding what is kind of the critical difference between two mostly like things, right? But they differ, like the mug, right? This is a difference between a cup and a mug might be the handle, right? What's the difference between war and civil war, or civic unrest and civil war, right? Thinking about how there are different gradients. For instance, is it protest? Is it a riot? Like, how do we know which one is what when we see it? This is the kind of we get leverage in answering those questions when we can objectively conceptualize and define what things are and how we know them when we see them. So it's superpowers, and I love it thus. Anyway, thanks so much for watching this video. You can always watch it again if you need to, and I'll see you next time.